English translation, 179th contact. Tuesday, 27th of February, 2024, 00.14 hours.
It is early in the day again, but your coming here is still very welcome, Pata. Greetings, dear friend.
Thank you. Greetings also to you, dear Edward, my friend.
I want to start by saying that strange things have been happening in my office again for days. Last Saturday, for example, I closed it when I was called away from the computer to the kitchen, but when I came back about 15 minutes later, there was this little booklet, a little book of poems, lying on the table in front of the computer, with a dedication from Inge Müller dated on the 11th of May 2002. Inge was a passive member and a friend of Rose and died in 2007. She apparently had this little work published by Die Blaue Eule in Germany in 2002, but apparently she forgot to give it to me at the time. But now it is suddenly lying on my desk in front of the computer, even though the office was locked and nobody was in there and also could not get in. What is more, the next day Mark brought me back the wallet with the change from the deposit. But when I counted it a little later, a coin fell to the floor and simply disappeared without a trace. Even when I searched for it with the help of Eva and by the light of a torch, it could no longer be found. Even when I looked for it again the next day, the search was fruitless, until today. It was like when we were doing the accounts together with Patrick, when a 500-franc note, they still existed back then, but now only 200-franc notes, disappeared from the table in front of our eyes. It was the same as with Pius, again when we were doing the accounts, when a small bundle of 50 notes suddenly disappeared on the table before our eyes, 10 notes that never reappeared. This was in contrast to Patrick's 500 note, which suddenly reappeared on the table after about 2 or 3 minutes. Yesterday, in one of my showcases, the head of a small statue I had from New York suddenly disappeared without a trace and never reappeared. Ava and I looked and realized that the head had been cut off flat, but had disappeared without a trace and had not reappeared. You can see it for yourself here.
Yes, the head is indeed missing. I am aware of these incidents from your stories. So I know that they happen in your workroom, and Arlian also told me about other strange incidents at the center that he personally experienced, as did several of his employees, even in your workroom. In this room, 3 persons from his work group were indecently molested in the same way, such as Engelbert, Maria, Marcel, my daughter Sim-Yase, the professor from Germany, and others. And I want to confess to you now that the same thing happened to me at the beginning of December 1989, when I was alone in your workroom, waiting for you, and you were burdened with unpleasantness.
So, also you. Maybe it was good that you did not tell me about it at the time. I was even sued in court 30 years later for these unpleasant incidents, which not only involved my ex and my daughter, but also the librarian of the university library, who has since retired, and perhaps our former first FIGU president was also involved, who, and as I was told, still goes in and out of my ex's office today.
That may be because...
I know that, because you guys told me that, which does not make me any hotter today.
That will really be so, because that which corresponds to the truth is past.
Yes, and you should let it rest, because what was once cannot be changed. But we can learn from it, and possibly make things better if necessary. Unfortunately, many human beings do not realize this, and do not change anything for the better, if they have suffered damage as a result of some crooked thinking or wrong action. This is particularly evident in human beings who have become addicted to alcohol, drugs, or a bad habit, behavior, or simply a bad habit.
This corresponds to what actually is and makes life difficult for many human beings.
As a rule, there is just a stubborn non-thinking and thus low intelligence behind it, but also a religious or worldly belief that creates a large shadow, but apparently cannot be jumped over this delusion. This is because every delusion of faith mutates into a completely uncontrollable habit.
That effectively corresponds to what you say, and which also corresponds to the truth.
That is so, but unfortunately it does not want to be understood, and consequently also not accepted by the Earthlings.
You have said that several times in our conversations.
Yes, I know, but it corresponds to the truth. That is also what this Mrs. She writes that it is not Putin who should be in the dock for starting the war in Ukraine, but America. And as it is written here word for word, America is guilty because it has violated all the great promises that NATO would never expand into the eastern states of Europe. In the early 1990s, however, NATO's criminal organization did expand eastwards. I was born in Ukraine, but I am married to a German man, and he also cannot understand why our country has chosen this clown actor Zelensky as its president, who is nothing but an evil warmonger, and who uses lies and acting to get many countries on his side and give them weapons to Ukraine. And Zelensky might get rich in the process, because he obviously still gets money and takes it into his own pocket. And I want to tell you that many thousands of us Ukrainians have fled to Russia and to Germany, as I and my husband have also done. I do not want to sanctify Putin, because after all he let the Russian soldiers invade Ukraine and started the war, but the fact is that America is to blame for this, and also for the fact that our 2 sons were killed who had to go to war, and also told us that often Russian soldiers are simply shot when they are captured by ours.
There is no need to read on, because what you have read so far is enough. We have also observed this over the last few weeks. But the murders and war crimes committed by the Ukrainian military and mercenaries are being concealed from the world public, and only the actions and behavior of the Russian side are being denounced. This is only because there is a global anti-Russian propaganda campaign, but America and Ukraine are praised, and many states are deceived, which are involved in the Ukrainian war as a result of Zelensky's lies and begging, as well as America's lies and global deception.
This is unfortunately so, which unfortunately will be unavoidable, which the proverbial low intelligence of those Earthlings who are friends of America and friendly to Zelensky, and believed their lying and beguiling, and thus,
which unfortunately will not be able to be helped.
yes, but let us leave that and turn to this letter here, which was brought to me by the post office yesterday. It is from a Mrs. She asked me where exactly I photographed the UFO V formation, which she had seen depicted in old UFO news reports. She also writes here that she had been searching for years to find my address, and now that she had received it by chance, she wanted to write to me and ask about everything. She has also been made aware of our Figu pages on the internet, and now reads diligently what is happening with us. However, she asked me not to mention her name and address because otherwise she would get into trouble with her relatives, who unfortunately have a different attitude to UFOs and are very negative. So I should also only write to her via her post office box and her letter, etc. Well, I think you would better read for yourself what the woman writes. Here you go.
You want to answer?
Of course, because I have nothing to hide. But I do not want to do this with a letter. I want to answer it here in our conversation, because if, as she writes, she reads the contact reports on the net, then that is enough.
But then it would be good if you do not keep this letter and likewise your personality answer. But you should answer these questions here openly, because it might also be of interest elsewhere and also publicly.
You are probably right. Then I will say the following and explain what just happened regarding the photo. It was when I photographed the V formation of UFOs passing high in the sky in Yuidakan one night, after which I sent the photo to the editors of a daily newspaper, who then published it. About a fortnight later, I received a letter from England, written in English, of course, which I had translated by Director Diemet and Captain Schnurrenberger. This letter was from a man whose name I do not remember, but who was translated by Captain Schnurnberger as Pendelholz. I remember that very well, because I wondered about this strange surname. Anyway, this man, who was somewhere in a place or town called Warminster or something like that, asked me about the photo and explained that he was extremely interested in UFOs and whether I had any other photographs. Consequently, with the director's permission, I also sent him the pictures that I was still able to take of the landing traces that were taken of Ascot's beamship. These were 4 pictures that showed the spiral-shaped pressed-down grass, which resulted when Ascot placed the landing discs of her beamship on the meadow and thus left traces behind. I was also able to take such photos in the 1970s and 1980s, when Sim Ya-se and others also set their beamships down on meadows. This changed, however, because UPlayARN adopted a more advanced technique from the Sonern, which meant that the grass was no longer harrowed and therefore also no longer pressed down in a spiral when the landing discs were set down. As a result, I was also no longer able to take the photos that I had previously shown to people from all over the world. As dozens of visitors from Switzerland, Germany, England, America, and Japan, etc. came to see me. This was already the case in Hinwil, when I lived on Oberdorfstrasse. Then it continued like this, also when I sold my house to the municipality, after which I lived on Wiehaldenstrasse, and finally here in Hinterschmidruti. As a rule, Guido was often there, who was allowed to watch from a distance of around 80 to 100 meters when Sim Ya-se flew in and landed. Sometimes Playa was also there with her beamship, but he was obliged to keep quiet about it. He also took me to Ringwell several times and spoke to my mum each time, because she was also interested and informed about UFOs. Well, later, when Hinterschmidruti became my place of residence, Jacobus was often there when I went to contacts, but he could only observe this and that from a distance. But he also really saw some things, such as his father, who was also able to film and photograph my footprints in the Wetzikon field, which were made when Sim Ya-se dropped me off in the middle of the snow-covered field, and I had to trudge out. Although of course no footprints led to the place where Sim Ya-se had dropped me off, but only from there to the distant road. The photos I took then of course found their way out into the world, but it was my ex-wife who passed them on to Martin Sorge, who lived in Ticino and often came to us in Hinwil on Wiehaldenstrasse, with Mara Algethi, born 1944, now a fortune-teller, life counselor, and painting artist, but who now denies knowing me. He falsified my original photos for the first time, lying and pretending to be an observer of the UPlayARN beamships. It turned out, however, that this lie was not widely disseminated, because the calendar he produced, in which he fabricated the photos of Sim Ya-se's beamship over the city of Morcode, did not sell well. However, I kept quiet about this when various people telephoned me about it, because I knew that I would only be attacked and insulted, and that otherwise the whole forgery would die out by itself. In any case, I soon heard nothing more from Martin Sorge and Mara Algethi, and when I phoned Mara 2 or 3 years ago because I was able to locate her at her new place of residence, she denied that she knew me. This was after she and Martin had visited us at Wiehaldenstrasse in Hinwil several times over a period of about 2 years, and our daughter Gilgamesha had also spent 3 weeks on holiday with them in Ticino.
That is what I am also aware of. Further also, that you did not even receive a reply from this man in England when you sent him your photos of the country tracks.
Yes, coming back to the man from England. The man was silent and never showed any sign of life. He also did not telephone, although I was allowed to give the telephone numbers of the director and the vicar, who worked around here and there, but both of them expected a call from the man from England in vain. Pastor Sieber also received no reply to a letter he wrote to the man. Unfortunately, this was also the case because the director and the pastor did not dare to openly admit that they were interested in UFOs. Both of them told me several times that they would definitely be declared mad and lose their jobs, as director and as priest, If it became known that they were interested in UFOs and they were also informed by me that Ascot was my contact person from the Pleiaren, etc. Just as the UFOs were not part of the Pleiaren. A man, I think his name was Vetter or something, and he was doing some kind of sport at the time. So he was obviously known for something. Also contacted the director and me when he saw my photo in the newspaper. He was also interested in everything, but he did not want it to become public knowledge. He also knew pastors who came to talk to me 3 or 4 times, but of course I had to keep quiet about it, which I promised to do. I did not find it difficult to keep quiet about it, because I was already used to it from Svath. But they allowed me to talk when I got old and was still alive, which they would not assume of themselves. But if things turned out differently than expected, then we would just have to see what was the right thing to do. Well, I think that the time since then has really been long enough for me to also be able to talk about it openly now and not do any harm. And the fact that I was also granted special rights by the headmaster at the time, which we had to hide and conceal from the outside world, which is why he also had to make judgments about me to his superiors that did not correspond to the truth, is a thing of the past. He also had to keep the whole thing quiet, as did Pastor Sieber, who, as he said, would have lost credibility with his flock as a pastor. Both of them also tried to persuade me several times that I should ask Ascot to allow them to fly in the beam ship at least once. But she vehemently refused, although she did allow them and comforted them by letting them watch her beam ship from close up when Ascot landed, but then made her beam ship invisible shortly afterwards. In this regard, however, I was advised by the director, that is to say forbidden, so to speak, to say anything about it, so I also had to keep quiet, which I have done to this day. If I speak now, I do not think any more damage can be done, because I do not think I have to make an effort to keep quiet anymore, and no longer have to worry about causing any damage. But we were all surprised that the man from England, this same Pendelholtz, never heard from me again after I sent him the photos of the country tracks by registered post, for which the director also gave me the receipt, but we never actually received a reply. So I also kept quiet about it, even when readers of the newspaper in which my photo was published wrote me nasty letters, and it all just got too stupid for me, so I did not bother any further. The director also kept silent to the outside world, although he was immensely interested in UFOs. Privately, and not because he was something higher up in the military service. He and I, of course, kept silent, which after such a long time I am now allowed to say, and can no longer do him any harm. It only surprised certain members of staff that he ordered that I be given a single room very quickly, while the majority of the pupils had to make do with communal rooms. This meant I could isolate myself and enjoy Ascot's presence unnoticed, even disappearing with her without anyone looking for me. This was all the easier for me as, in addition to the preparation work, I could walk around completely alone and unsupervised when I was finished. So it also happened that the director chauffeured me to Zurich with a few other boys, and we were able to attend George Adamski's lecture on lies when he appeared at the Volkshaus, where Ascot and I gave this liar hell. At that time, the director often came to the armory, where I alone had to prepare the vegetables for all the many persons in the company, although I do not remember how many there really were. In any case, the director was very interested in everything, also what Ascot and I talked about, saw, and experienced together. And he kept asking me if I could persuade Ascot to fly in their beam ship at least once, which he could not do, nor could the priest, who also had to remain silent to the outside world, as did I, of course.
What you both really struggled to do, which was to remain silent.
Of course. It is also likely that I will be called a liar now, because many people will not want to admit the truth as such. But that does not bother me, because the low intelligence of the majority of the stupid knows no bounds and is truly limitless. The lowly intelligent are only believers and those who deny the truth, who unfortunately lack all logic, understanding and reason to think for themselves and therefore think for themselves, just as they also rise high above all cleverness and effectively believe that they are smarter than the truth of reality itself.
And how do you want to answer this woman's letter question? What, who, and from where are the beings of the UFOs, and what do they want?
You know that your father, Jusfath, has already suggested to me that I never say anything about this. Consequently, I should keep quiet. I may say, however, that these have been seen and worshipped as gods or goddesses by earthlings since time immemorial. No amount of logical, rational, and reasonable explanations will persuade the majority of earthling believers to think for themselves and for themselves, instead of simply being faithfully devoted to a religious or worldly belief and frowning upon the effective truth. On the contrary, earthlings, through their belief in God or gods, have invented insane religions that demand worship to an imaginary god and gods, as well as to supposed saints. This is combined with crazy, confused, bloody and even deadly rites, confusing chanting, fanatical dances and insane meditations as well as lies, deceit, murder and manslaughter, war, terror, hatred, threats, deception, exploitation and enslavement, etc. Correct and independent thinking in logic, understanding, and reason rarely comes into play. But when it does, it has a good effect. There is probably nothing more to say about this, but it is interesting that the woman uses almost my name for this murderous organization, NATO. I probably do not need to read any more. And I realized last year that a large part of the population in Ukraine is on Russia's side, and not Zelensky's. So this part would love him to disappear. Just as they do not want America in their country, and do not think much of the murderous organization NATO, which is why they are also opposed to membership of NATO, and want the war to prevent it. This is actually also the purpose of the war, because at least those who think clearly on this matter, namely the human beings living in Ukraine, who recognize what NATO really is, namely nothing other than a murderous organization focused on killing and destruction, mainly at America's mercy, do not want Ukraine to also belong to this murderous society. If everything is assessed correctly and seen clearly, then it will be recognized that all the individual members, from the least soldier to the absolute highest commander of this gang of murderers, that is to say, murderous organization, consist only of depraved elements whose mindset is without any doubt directed only towards murder and destruction. None of these humanly more than depraved, completely degenerate, murderous, miserable, dog-wretched elements is worth more than the last useless iota of nothing.
These are facts that we, Bermunda, Florena, Enjana, Quetzal, and I have been able to clearly establish and observe during the last few weeks. Bermunda, Florena, Quetzal, Enjana and I were tasked with observing and assessing the events of war on Earth, which meant that we were also able to observe the flight events and realized that many refugees from Ukraine chose Russia as a place of refuge, and many continue to consider this. However, we were also able to find out and indeed establish that Russia is endeavoring to protect many pro-Russian human beings in Ukraine in a variety of wise ways, which is very difficult, especially now during the war, but on the other hand causes opposition among those who are hostile to Russia. On the other hand, we were also able to find out what is really happening around Navalny, which is what you wanted to know. He is glorified by his supporters, but they do not know who and what this man really was. And I say was because he has now gone the last way of his life, through his own fault, because he created a lot of enmity for himself where he was interned with his unworthy way of thinking and behavior, which made him very unpopular with his fellow prisoners. This man was a notorious liar and deceiver who shamefully deceived his followers in a fanatical lust for power and was and lived in such a self-centered way. The fact that he had, in truth, orientated himself towards falsehood, deceit, thievery, and racism and lived accordingly is to be described as distinctly criminal, as is also the fact that he used all his followers without hesitation to stand up for him and his quest for power. He was an unrivaled, fraudulent psychopath who also suffered in prison because he was denied alcohol, to which he was addicted. In addition to this, however, he was addicted to various drugs that were obtained for him without authorization. As he was facing many years in prison due to the very stressful conditions and the length of his sentence, he decided to escape from them by secretly hoarding the drugs until they were sufficient for a severe overdose, and he ingested them, which of course inevitably led to his death, allowing him to escape his responsibility. His followers, who had been deceived and misled by him, are now using this to refuse to accept the truth and illegally hold the Russian government responsible for his death, falsely accusing it of murdering this man. We also had to observe everything in the Middle East, and came to the realization that murder and destruction are also taking place in the same way as in Ukraine. The same thing is also happening in the Red Sea area, where the Houthis are being fought by the Americans and the British. All the ringleaders in all places are equally degenerate and murderous in their lust for power, and also ruthless in their destructive and murderous behavior. They have all degenerated in the same way. First and foremost, the devious American leadership, especially the hegemonistic and truly senile President Biden, as well as the vengeful Putin in Russia and the warmongering Zelensky in Ukraine. Then in Yemen, the supreme leader of the Zaydites, that is to say Houthis, Hussein Badreddin al-Houthi, as in the Middle East in Israel, the murderous and destructive fanatic Netanyahu, as with the Palestinians, who are actually Arabs, the radical Islamic leader Yahya Sinwar. And in addition to the grouping of secret and covert neo-Nazis in the leadership of Germany and France with regard to President Emmanuel Macron, who is incapable of reason and logic, all of whom, in their unintelligent senses and desires, are thoughtlessly taking sides with Zelensky, they are once again insidiously and subtly engaged in infiltrating their own military into Ukraine in order to participate in the war in such a foreign intervening, murderous and destructive way in order to politically destroy Russia as a state. But that will have the consequence if this delusional idea is realized after all, and reason does not finally break through, and the helpfulness for Ukraine that has been politically fomented by America is ended, and the helpful as well as hypocritical and helping state leaders recognize the truth and put an end to their false actions. The strange world war that has been going on for the last 2 years, waged by completely unreasonable state leaders and their parts of the populations who are in favor of the wrong actions of their state leaders, do not know, and also cannot imagine that a truly global war is imminent that will be as vicious, terribly destructive, and devastating as never before in living memory. This will be the case if the large number of unscrupulous, hateful, and also partisan rulers of around 50 states, as well as the like-minded parts of their populations, continue to supply weapons, money, etc., and also promises to Zelensky, and he, who is truly acting on behalf of and protecting America, can wage his war, which will also incite Russia and above all Putin to do his worst. The fact that unscrupulous mercenaries are also taking part in the whole thing, costing many human lives and causing unparalleled destruction, will only be a minor matter and will be forgotten. In this regard, we have learnt that mercenaries from Switzerland are also engaged in murderous activities, which is also known to the Russian Secret Service, which is trying to get hold of them in order to punish them, which will probably be nothing other than an execution. And furthermore, it must be said that everything you predicted has obviously come true, and I have now also read in my father's annals as a clear statement that a new front of anti-Semitism has formed and opened up. as you yourselves realized at the time when you fathomed what is happening today. This, as it also proves to be true, that your prediction regarding will come true, and
It really will come to pass, for this is what Svath and I have experienced and seen, which unfortunately cannot be helped, but all this I will dot, for I am keeping to what he instructed me, namely that I should keep silent about it. Consequently, I may only tell you Pleiaren. He has, after all, taken that into consideration, and allowed me to speak of it to you, but to be silent to every earthling, and that also.
I have also read this in my father's annals, so I am aware that you may speak to all of us who maintain contact with you. But you may not speak to Earth's humanity in such a wise that they receive foreknowledge of what the future will bring. Those responsible for world events would think up and do wrong things all the more, which would lead to an even greater catastrophe.
I know that because all these wannabes and power addicts are sick and power-hungry idiots. They are also lowly intelligent and simple-minded. And unfortunately, we also have such simple-minded people in our national government here in Switzerland who make a mockery of our neutrality and also want foreign judges to judge Switzerland and the Swiss people, which is why these traitors to the country are endeavoring to effectively sneak our country into the EU dictatorship. Our entire national government is unfortunately riddled with unworthy and irresponsible behavior that is incapable of any logic, understanding, and reason, and in its madness, not only disregards the righteous and sensible in the government and their clear foresight, and destroys what is good, but also forces the country and its people into misery and ruin. This truth is currently being demonstrated by the whole nonsense of the endeavor to pay out a 13th AHV pension. Because if this is accepted in the election vote against all reason, it will cause very big problems. That alone, what?
Unfortunately, that is effective fact, that is clear, otherwise you would not say it. Also, now. However, I have to tell you about Arleon, whereby everything refers to the fact that he and his employees have found the solution to protect you from the attacking energies, that you, Arleon, will come to see you and explain everything to you.
What he already partially explained to me months ago, and I have put into action. Consequently, while I can always sense that these religious energies continue to bring their influence to bear, their powers I am able to control as a result of Arleon's explanation and advice.
I understand that, but your efforts are characterized by success.
That is so, but it has been hard and difficult at times, but you know I do not give in easily. But fortunately, there are still a minority of human beings who also endeavor to do the correct thing, who strive to really become human beings, and therefore study hard and work on themselves. This, as evidenced, for example, by this email written to me recently, in which the man has become a human being who has not remained a believer, but has become a self-thinker. When I first saw him around 40 years ago, he was still a young man, but in the meantime, he has learnt a lot and has turned himself into a human being who walks firmly through life.
On the 21st of February, 2024, 9:53 hours, wrote,
Salome, dear Billy. Salome, possibly, dear other person reading this mail. Today I am taking the liberty of sending a personal email following the obituary for I would like to thank you once again, warmly and sincerely for the invitation. I am of course very pleased that I was also able to fulfill the claim or purpose of the Figu in a meaningful way. It is now 40 years since I moved to Switzerland for good. I arrived in Winterthur by train on the 1st of August 1984. In the course of all the developments, there was once a moment, during a visit from you, dear and esteemed Billy, when there was a dialogue on the subject of my life's mission or direction. I can no longer remember all the details exactly, but I do remember the exact place in the entrance to the living room. But I can remember very clearly that you counselled, said, to first of all ensure peace in a small circle within the family, or something like that, that it was a good task to have a positive effect in a small direct environment. Well, the reason for my email today, and the reason why I am taking the liberty of addressing you personally for the first time, as I did back then, is that I can now look ahead to the time I have left in my life. It has been my privilege to close the circle with, and to take advantage of the learning opportunities in such a way that red threads for evolution have crystallized and a neutral positive peace has manifested itself. One of the questions I am now asking myself is to what extent, in addition to my personal responsibility to dedicate more direct time and focus in my life to the inner and evolutionary, I can and perhaps should also be more evolutionary in a formal sense. I have certainly embraced life on the outside, always endeavoring to leave this world happily. Without being able to explain exactly what that means at the beginning, I have followed this evolutionary impulse and have succeeded in listening more and more to my input and intuition, step by step. At the same time, I endeavored to create benefits and a sense of evolutionary development in this world on the outside. This inner impulse allowed me to find my individual career steps. And I was able to recognize many things that you, in your wisdom, are of course already aware of. The course of time has given me evolutionary impulses at the crossroads of life, not all of which I was able to absorb perfectly immediately. But I have the feeling that in principle I have also been able to find my way on the outside with the creational laws and recommendations through the impulses. I also read the Om and the Goblet of the Truth in a focused way a few years ago, but I am now in the process of doing so again and clearly feel the invitation of my spirit to focus much more deeply on my own responsibility. And I am driven by the question of how much more consistently I can, may, or must also accept this personal responsibility for more evolutionary work in a formal sense. And now I would like to take the liberty today of following on from your statement at the time. Also in the sense of an inquiry as to whether there might be a way in which you could give me an impulse again, as you did back then, as a glow on the horizon for the next steps. I am following an impulse. I apologize if it is not appropriate to do so in an email. And I await the developments that may arise from this email. For today, a heartfelt Salome in sincere and deep gratitude for all your work, based on the information from the Om. B.
Remarkable, really very remarkable. Quite obviously, B has become knowledgeable about the teaching and is making serious efforts with it, which brings him success in various relationships and benefits him for his life.
I also see it that way. I also find it admirable that people, when they begin to think for themselves, endeavor of their own accord, develop themselves further, find the effective truth, and are able to work themselves out to become real human beings. I think that is really remarkable, as you said, and has found and traveled the path to this himself and is continuing to do so.
That is really gratifying.
Effectively, it really pleases me. But I also find it gratifying that human beings from all over the world are interested in what we talk about together when we have our conversations. This is demonstrated, for example, by the following email that Burke sent to Bernadette from Turkey. Burke is a friend from Turkey who is in regular contact with us, mainly with Bernadette. He now writes the following regarding the conversation we recently had with each other, where he also sent some pictures that were taken, and show the ruins that were excavated at the place that I still half remember, when I was there with Svath, and saw how human beings lived and worked back then, got along very well and ran a democracy that was really a democracy that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the fraudulent which today is widespread worldwide as an alleged democracy, and is based on the fact that a majority system is valid in elections, which does not correspond in any wise to a democracy. But rather, if you look at it somewhat favorably, to a partial democracy, that is to say half and half, but which has nothing whatsoever to do with a true democracy. However, as far as the following email is concerned, Burka has written the following interesting thing, which relates to my memories of earlier times with Sfath, when I was with him a long time ago among a people in eastern Turkey, and experienced and learnt a lot.
Dear Bernadette, hello, dear friend. How are you all doing? It has been a while since we have not written to each other. I am doing very well, and I am still on holiday with my family until the first week of March. But the reason for my writing is different. A few hours ago, I was looking at the last contact report and read Billy's explanation of the origin of democracy. When I read his lines, it suddenly occurred to me where he was with Sfath about 11,000 years ago. Only one place corresponds to his description and the year, namely Göbekli Tepe Bulbous Hill. The site is located in the southeastern Turkish city of Şanlıurfa, and a certain Klaus Schmidt led the excavations at this archaeological site from 1996 to 2014. I assume this is the person Billy told about the experience he had been on with Sfath. Now to the word Billy introduced, orlakta, which is very close to the Turkish word ortak in use today, meaning something shared that belongs to common property, common participation, or simply partner. We also call the word for sickle orak, which comes from the same verb for harvesting, dividing, cutting, and mowing, which is a simple tool for agriculture and farming, as did the peoples of the site at the time. I searched the dictionaries of the languages spoken at the time and in the region, but could not find anything very similar to ours, so it remains just an assertion of mine. Unfortunately, many documentary films have been made about Göbekli Tepe, and many controversial claims have emerged that this site has been treated in the same way as the Giza pyramids, namely that extraterrestrials helped build them, or that the megaliths are stargates or represent ancient technology. Recently, a new stone statue was found depicting a man with an uncircumcised penis. The Turkish government censored this when it was broadcast on national television. And as far as I know, the part of the stone figure found on which the penis is carved has since been removed and mutilated. Billy, I would like to ask if there was any extraterrestrial influence in this site at the time, which I am not assuming at all, also what ethnic group and for what purpose they built this site. A few years ago, when I was not yet thoroughly familiar with the Meyer case, I asked Christian a similar question, and he only told me that the earliest pyramids are much older than Göbekli Tepe, about 73,000 years old. I also checked to see if Göbekli Tepe had been talked about before, but could not find anything about it in the contact reports. I am also adding some pictures of the newly found stone figure and the area in general. Best regards, and Salome, Berkey.
And there are the pictures he emailed along showing some of the ancient ruins of what is left to this day, of what I now somehow remember it looking like back then. So that was what Burke emailed, and to his questions I can only say what I remember from back then, such as that there was no talk of aliens somehow. At least Sfath did not translate anything like that to me from what he talked to people. Also, the language translator that Sfath gave me just in case did not translate a word as extraterrestrial, stars, sky, or anything that would have indicated outer space or anything like that. But instead, and I remember this well. There was talk of commonality, hunting, bird life, worship and common labor, personal property, common property, regulation and management of all things, and so on. I remember that really well, because Svath explained a lot of what he had learnt in conversation. And I also remember that these human beings were an extensive community of many thousands, which they called Dennis or something like that. I do not remember the exact name, but they had a sign that has stayed with me to this day, which I can also record for you here. T looks like this, and Svath explained to me that this community used signs for certain things, like this one for community, which had already been used by their earliest ancestors, who, as Svath explained, are said to have invented it well over 6,000 years earlier. He further explained at that time that this sign would be used and spread far into the future and even preserved until the time of Emmanuel. Although I have never seen it anywhere since then, when Svath and I were with these people, I think that it has been preserved, as Svath said. And what Burke writes about the statue and also emailed a picture, it is idiotic that the statue was damaged for religious reasons, because when it was made, there was no Islam yet that demanded penis circumcision, which only came about because, well, if he now also mentions the pyramids of Giza, that is to say, if he now refers to the pyramids of Giza and their age, then the archaeologists claim that they are only a few millennia old cannot be challenged, although their actual origin dates back to around 70,000 years ago, but were only renovated a few thousand years ago. The Sphinx, which was previously created as a lioness and whose head was cut off and replaced with a human head, was also altered several millennia ago. Forgeries were already conjured up in ancient times, just as original things were also simply changed and adapted to new circumstances, etc., such as the head of the Sphinx, which unintentionally appears as a forgery, but truthfully does not correspond to a forgery, because it was only a change and adaptation to a new government.
But you should not mention that when recalling and writing down the conversation, because what you explained regarding the origin of but also regarding other falsifications of the truth, such as the so-called Christian Shroud of Death, whose fabric, as a result of our latest and extremely accurate analyses with Sona technology last year, shows an age of 669 years, proves how addicted to falsification and deceitful many Earth's humanity are. The head and the very peaceful-looking face on the alleged Shroud of Death point to a man aged around 64 who was not dead at the time the image was made, but alive, because according to our very precise and absolutely error-free findings, there is no doubt that the reproduced image of the man does not show a dead but a living human being. We have not yet been able to find out how this was possible around 670 years ago and what kind of technology was used to produce this alleged Shroud of Death. It was necessary to travel back in time to find out what kind of possibility was used to make this image, which was known on Earth at the time as and the like, so the imprint on the cloth was made in this way, which our new analysis revealed. That various other utensils, that is to say, alleged props from Emmanuel's time, but also elsewhere, in museums or simply as antiquities, etc., which are supposed to be in connection with Emmanuel and are in circulation, is in every single case based on fraud and forgery, as Arleon's experts have investigated and clearly clarified. Regarding the alleged Shroud of Death, the last 3 millennia have also been researched, whereby it was found that 900 years after Emmanuel, a forgery of a Shroud of Death had already been made, which was also supposed to show an image of the dead body of Emmanuel. After which, however, this forgery disintegrated into its components over time, while the forgery created around 400 years later has survived to this day.
That is clear, is it not, that I will not mention what I have said regarding the explanation and all that you say in confidence, because I know that all this is not to become known, because consequently I will dot. But if you have now brought up the alleged shroud of death again, then we really should not talk about it anymore, because in this respect too, Christians, that is to say believers, do not want the truth to be known or accepted anyway. What was also done in this way with regard to the ancient statue, as Burke writes, is not only a desecration of the statue, but a falsification of it and of antiquity. And this is also the case, and no excuse me if everything was done for misguided religious reasons. Religion and religious belief also do not justify such an action, because in the case of this statue, it was created around 10 millennia earlier, before the religion of Islam came into being, whose beliefs were then used, among other things, to circumcise or mutilate the penis on the statue. This is probably in addition to other things that falsely crept into the false religious doctrine and that Mohammed never ordered. Just as many other false and fabricated things came about in Christianity. Not to mention the fact that Emmanuel was falsely called Jesus, something he would never have also dared to dream of. Both were only absolutely upright in their attitude and orientated towards reality and truth, honesty, goodness, humanity, peace, freedom and honesty, etc., but never in any altered wise towards what was falsely attributed to them and made out of their teaching of truth in terms of religion and blatant belief. Emmanuel's and Muhammad's teaching, which already brought all the bringers of truth back to the time of Nocedemion, neither demanded nor demanded worship of the heralds of truth, nor any prostrate worship of them, an imaginary god or saints, as well as no holy acts, rites, things, movements, crucifixions, ablutions, or incense, etc. The preachers also never demanded any nonsensical frippery in the form of crosses, prayer stones, rosaries in places of prayer, houses of prayer and the like, nor did they demand a religious blessing or religious baptism, etc. Their teaching of truth was solely focused on the fact that human beings must be free in their very own thinking, and must decide and act according to their own ability and right about right and wrong. Their teaching therefore included that human beings should recognize the positive and the negative, and that they should also think for themselves in logic, understanding and reason, independently of any belief, and therefore make correct and just decisions and act in accordance with them. Earth's humanity, however, consistently acts contrary to reality and truth, because it practices the death penalty, for example, wages war and terror, constantly falsifies the truth, just as it unscrupulously falsifies food. As I also saw with my own eyes as a boy in the coffee roasting plant in Bulach, when the ground coffee was heavily mixed with a lot of flour from ground grain and then sold. Many buyers were also cheated by this, of course, just like those who bought tea on a large scale from Eastern countries, which, however, as I saw myself, was colored to make it appear fraudulently as a certain variety or as matured, which, as I have just said, I have seen myself with tea producers. The saying that has been used since time immemorial, the world wants to be cheated, is probably true. The fact and truth is that no normal human being, if I may speak of normal at all, advocates, demands or practices revenge, retribution or capital punishment, war and terror, let alone causes, instigates or wages war himself. This, just as a normal human being also does not command or condone terror and destructive demonstrations, the infliction of harm or physical aggression, or even harm to life and the destruction of human achievements, etc. It is already a monstrous crime that human beings are forced by law, against their own will, to militarily raise a weapon against fellow human beings and kill or murder them. And this is usually done without knowing the person to be murdered, without ever having seen them before, and/or without them having done anything to harm them.
But this injustice goes much further, because as I have fathomed during my stays here on Earth, for example, especially here in your home country, money is generously given by this state to foreign countries for alleged sponsorship and aid, whereby often very large sums of millions of francs, which are unjustly collected from the citizenry through taxes, are given away for dubious purposes, etc., and shifted and squandered in foreign states. I have noticed that large sums of money end up in the accounts of wealthy state leaders, who enrich themselves almost without limits in this wise and
at the expense of Switzerland's bona fide taxpayers. But this is actually public knowledge, which is tacitly tolerated by the population because nobody dares to do anything about it. Moreover, paradoxically, the people are in favor of this fraud because they are religiously delusional and believe that squandering taxpayers' money in this way serves good causes and is Christian. This is despite the fact that many of the people actually know that some of the unjust people in foreign governments and the heads of aid organizations are enriching themselves and becoming millionaires through this aid money from the tax money of the Swiss people. As your daughter Simya say, and I have already discovered in our research.
This is indeed the case, and my daughter Simya say also told me so. Through such machinations, large amounts of taxpayers' money are squandered senselessly instead of using the money to care for the poor and underprivileged in their own country, and also to do everything possible to protect the vital nature with all its ecosystems and the increasingly impaired fauna and flora. However, this is completely neglected by the leaders of the responsible state officials, because as we have come to realize, these leaders are only loud-mouthed and lack expertise in what is really very urgently needed to preserve vital nature and its fauna and flora. Not even their so-called experts are educated and experienced enough to recognize what needs to be done effectively. They do not realize what is urgently needed for nature and its flora and fauna, but instead, they are doing the opposite by mismanaging the landscapes, forests, waters, mountains, and regions, with the result that everything is having an overall detrimental effect on the naturalness of all ecosystems, and therefore also on all life. And as we have seen, which is frightening to judge, this is the result of the delusion of know-it-all behavior and power-grabbing by the representatives of all administrative offices, etc., which prevents the correct thing from being done to preserve nature and its fauna and flora. It also results, as we have seen, that these officials have no real knowledge or experience of natural life, and therefore counteract it with false orders and commands, which is the right thing to do. As a result, human beings who responsibly and with true knowledge regarding life, the need for the correct flourishing and existence of nature and its fauna and flora do the right thing. Consequently, they can flourish and live, are hounded with false impositions in the form of orders, commands, laws, and punishments, etc., and thus prevented from doing what is necessary.
All this, that is to say regarding the squandering of money, the destruction of nature, fauna and flora, all ecosystems as a whole and thus landscapes and bodies of water, as well as forests and mountains, floodplains, fields, moors and marshes, etc., and thus inevitably also the atmosphere and climate, is unfortunately not, little or not at all, taken into account in Switzerland. Especially not by those who squander masses of coal for supposedly good causes, and development aid abroad, and privately fill the wallets and bank accounts of foreign rulers. And the fact that traitors to the country are still involved in the government, who make a mockery of our neutrality and are tolerated by the people instead of shunning such traitorous elements, is typical of the general low-mindedness and stupidity, the very non-thinking that should be done instead, but which is followed by some crazy, confused and useless belief that makes people indifferent, lacking in initiative and completely inactive, fearful, ignorant of reality, and also dismissive of the truth. As a result, the people are incapable, and this is the same in all countries of the world, of doing what would be correct, namely to stand on the back foot, that only good and truly governable people can steer the helm of government. And consequently, only human beings who behave with integrity and have experience of life can exercise the leadership of the country and the people. This, while unfit government vegetables do not belong in a government and should be chewed out by the people, who unfortunately do not seem to have the courage to do so, and only keep their fists in their apron pockets and trouser pockets, if they have the guts to do so at all. This is more than questionable when we see how those in power and their rationally blind supporters and like-minded people instigate and unleash war, murder, manslaughter, destruction and ruin against the meaning of peace and the freedom of the people. This, as it is and has been happening in Ukraine, all caused by America's fault, but triggered by Russia. Then in the Middle East, the murderous and destructive war started by Hamas, which attacked Israel, and in the Red Sea against Yemen, where ruthless murderers are also at work, causing immense destruction. Now, this is different from the fact that certain individual incompetent elements are sitting in the government in Bern, also in the Federal Council in peacetime as traitors to the country, and are drawing a salary of no less than CHF 472,958.00 in the current year. However, the people are too cowardly to remove such elements from the government, just as the co-governors also fail to do so, but instead protect these nasty co-governing elements who, for example, make a mockery of Switzerland's neutrality and allow them to wreak further havoc. The majority of the people obviously prefer to twiddle their thumbs and put up with everything that such government incompetence and traitors to the country do, which also includes those who want to sell off our homeland to the EU dictatorship, and are already doing so step by step. So that when everything in this regard is over, foreign judges will decide on the weal and woe of the Swiss.
That really threatens, as I know from my father's annals.
Yes, I know that just as well as I also know that the war skirmish in Ukraine due to America's hegemonic actions as well as the partisan and thoughtless meddling of the 50 or so countries and their supply of weapons, ammunition and money to Zelensky will have the consequence that
You should have...
is also not what I have in mind. I am just telling you. The little dots should suffice and make you think for yourself. Something that those who think further than just up to the tip of their nose will certainly do.
The way I see Swiss politics, it is on the road to ruin.
You are probably right, because when I consider all that is true and correct, how far-sighted, correct thinking and acting Switzerland's rulers also were at the time, when I was still young, but see how wrong, confused and destructive thinking, acting and ruling is today, then it is more than just recognizable that Switzerland is rapidly going downhill. It is very regrettable and absolutely incomprehensible that the Swiss people are sleeping with their eyes open, as is also the case with Earth's humanity in general. The truth is simply not perceived, because indifference, pleasure and alotria dominate human beings, as does the desire to be rich without having to work, as does also making oneself important in public. For example, on television through self-branding or influencing, whereby a lot of money is siphoned off from viewers as a result of stupid influencing, which they pay lowly intelligent and simple-minded. The same happens with sport, especially football, as high entrance fees are paid to watch footballers chug a leather ball around. This is instead of keeping themselves busy and doing something for the health of their own bodies. Many people who do this are then surprised when their health suddenly leaves a lot to be desired. But let me ask you a question. What about the writing I do for you? Is it still such that
It has remained the same, for which we are also very grateful to you for all your work.
that is good? I do not want any thank you for that. Besides, I am always busy, never unemployed and never bored. And then there are the contact conversations that I have to call up and write down. This is interesting, however, because religious energies interfere with me so much that it takes me 3 to 4 times longer to retrieve and write down the conversations than it used to. Whole sections, or sometimes even everything that I have already retrieved and written down, are suddenly deleted, so I have to start all over again. It is also the same with the sticks when I transfer everything to them to have Bernadette correct it. Words or whole sections are suddenly missing, or everything is mixed up or contradictory to what I have written and is correct in the computer, etc. However, what is interesting is that all of what I write down for you works without a hitch and is not affected by the disruptive energies.
You have explained this to me and also to Arlian, and we consider this really strange, which Arlian cannot explain, as it is also unexplainable to all his specialists. It is also puzzling to him and his people that your handwriting is also affected when you write, inexplicably and unintentionally as well as uncontrollably, writing completely wrong letters and numbers when you finish something by hand.
That is why I always have to use Ava when I have to write something by hand, such as telephone numbers or addresses on envelopes. But you see, this is typical American hegemony madness.
By law, the United States declares itself the owner of all outer space December 5, 2015.
No joke, not an April Fool's joke, not satire. The U.S. Senate and Congress approved a bill that would declare all of space to be an American administrative space. Even U.S. President Barack Obama has already signed the document, which gives the USA the unrestricted right to license mining rights throughout space. Washington, USA. The UN Outer Space Treaty of 1967 stipulated that outer space with all its celestial bodies does not belong to any single state, but to all of humanity. However, the UN Outer Space Treaty allows states to use and research them, but expressly prohibits declaring celestial bodies as property. The decades-old regulation has so far met with international approval, but the USA now appears to have changed its mind. The bill, which has already been signed by the U.S. Senate, Congress, and President Barack Obama, declares the U.S. the sole mineral rights manager for all of outer space. In doing so, the USA claims the right to license commercial uses of space, such as the exploitation of asteroids or the colonization of other planets. 3 approvals are still missing. All that is missing is the approval of the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and NASA. But this is probably just a formality. After that, the power to decide who can mine raw materials in space and bring them to Earth and who can send which equipment to foreign celestial bodies rests solely with the U.S. authorities. Official reactions from the UN, ESA, and also from the Russian and Chinese space agencies are still pending.
The hegemony mania of America knows no bounds, which is why the entire space of the Sol system is included in the mania of domination, which will also lead to...
What you say, I will put dots there, though, because I know that it will become reality. And that is not good if the Earthlings know that in advance, because then everything would become much more...
I suppose that would be the case. But that is enough for today about what we have discussed so far, because I have other things I want to talk to you about, and I want to keep them between us.
As you wish. Then,